Booting up a 20-year-old masterpiece like Grand Theft Auto San Andreas on a top-tier modern gaming rig should, in theory, deliver the ultimate definitive experience. With gigabytes of fast system memory, ultra-speed solid-state storage, and dedicated graphics cards capable of rendering complex scenes instantly, a classic from the PlayStation 2 era should glide by with flawless execution. Instead, players who download the legacy PC version and jump into the fictional state of San Andreas are often met with a deeply jarring reality. Rather than running beautifully, the game behaves like an unstable simulation on the verge of total collapse. Cars lose all traction at the slightest turn, characters instantly drown while attempting to swim across a basic river, and the physical properties of the environment seem to actively twist and break. The grand irony of this technical degradation is that your high-end hardware isn't failing because it is too weak, it is failing because it is far too powerful, throwing out frames at such an astronomical velocity that it is literally ripping the underlying fabric of the game engine apart. To understand why modern technological progress translates into physical catastrophe for Carl Johnson's world, one must step back to the engineering constraints of the early 2000s. When Rockstar Games was developing San Andreas, they utilized Criterion Software's Renderware engine, a cross-platform framework that powered the vast majority of sixth-generation video games. During this console era, hardware was a known, unyielding constant rather than a moving target. The target platform, the PlayStation 2, ran games at a fixed hard-coded baseline of 30 frames per second. Because developers could guarantee that the console's processor would deliver a frame precisely every 33.3 milliseconds, they engineered the entire ecosystem around this temporal anchor. In this architecture, game logic ticks, animation cycles, audio synchronization, and script triggers were not independent entities running on a real-world clock. They were hard-coded to fire in lockstep with the rendering engine. If the screen presented 30 frames in a second, the game knew exactly how much distance a car should travel or how fast an animation should play per frame, treating the frame rate as the absolute pulse of the universe. This architectural assumption creates an engineering disaster when the software is uncoupled from its legacy constraints and allowed to run raw on a modern PC system. When a player turns off the game's internal frame limiter to chase higher performance metrics, the engine's internal math breaks down completely.
Modern game engines use a concept known as delta time, a dynamic variable that measures the exact time difference between the current frame and the preceding one, scaling physics calculations dynamically so that game speed remains identical whether running at 30, 60, or 200 frames per second. Early engines like Renderware, however, often multiplied movement values by a fixed constant, operating under the assumption that the frame rate would never fluctuate above its design ceiling. When a modern graphics card pushes the presentation loop into hundreds of frames per second, the engine tries to run its logic loops at that exact same astronomical frequency. The time slice allocated to each frame drops to mere fractions of a millisecond, causing the physics engine's internal mathematical calculations to multiply out of control and throw out wildly incorrect outputs. One of the most famous and immediate casualties of this temporal acceleration is the game's swimming mechanics, a feature that was heavily marketed as a massive gameplay upgrade over Grand Theft Auto Vice City. When a player dives into water while running the game at high frame rates, they quickly discover that CJ is entirely incapable of forward momentum. He will play his swimming animation at a frantic, hyper-accelerated speed, yet his position in the global coordinate space will remain completely frozen, or worse, he will slowly sink and drown. This occurs because the engine calculates fluid dynamics and water resistance on a per-frame basis. At 30 frames per second, the backward drag force applied by the water is perfectly balanced against the forward thrust vector generated by the player's button inputs. At 144 frames per second or higher, the engine applies that drag force nearly 5 times as frequently within the same real-world second. Because the forward acceleration value does not scale up proportionally, the water resistance math completely overwhelms the movement loop, transforming a refreshing swim into a liquid prison. A similar breakdown compromises the vehicle physics, turning the iconic driving mechanics of San Andreas into an uncontrollable slip-and-slide nightmare. When driving a vehicle at uncapped frame rates, the calculations governing tyre friction, braking force, and downforce coefficients tear themselves apart. Tapping the brake pedal at a high frame rate applies stopping pressure over so many compressed logic frames that the tyres instantly lock up, causing vehicles to lose all lateral stability and slide uncontrollably as if travelling on sheets of pure ice.
Furthermore, the game's gravity calculations are updated too frequently, meaning that if a car leaves the ground after launching off a stunt ramp, the engine registers the downward gravitational pull too many times per second. This causes vehicles to feel unnaturally heavy in the air, instantly slamming back down to the pavement with excessive force, and completely ruining the arcade-style physics that defined the original experience. Even ambient systems like the flashing frequency of police sirens or the pathfinding updates of civilian traffic artificial intelligence accelerate into a chaotic blur because their execution loops are tied directly to the runaway frame rate. Beyond navigation and locomotion, the game's highly celebrated character progression systems and gym minigames become entirely broken and humanly impossible to complete when performance values scale past their historical limits. Inside the Los Santos gym, players can use the bench press or stationary bicycle to increase CJ's muscle and stamina metrics, a mechanic that requires tapping a specific button rapidly to overcome a dropping resistance meter. The speed at which this resistance meter decays is hard-coded to drop by a set percentage on every single frame tick. At 30 frames per second, a human player can easily match the decay rate with rhythmic physical button presses. However, at 300 frames per second, the resistance meter drops 10 times faster within the exact same real-world second. The window of opportunity to register an input shrinks from a comfortable couple of hundred milliseconds down to a mere handful of milliseconds, far outstripping the ceiling of human reaction time and physical capability. Without using a macro or manually forcing the software back to its legacy timing constraints, a staple feature of the game's role-playing architecture becomes entirely walled off. This systemic failure highlights a fascinating reality regarding technical debt, software optimization, and the philosophy of video game preservation. It serves as a stark reminder that in software architecture, raw execution speed is entirely meaningless without proper structural control and frame pacing. The developers at Rockstar and Criterion weren't incompetent, they were simply engineering an incredibly complex open-world simulation for highly specialized fixed silicon that was never intended to scale alongside decades of desktop computing evolution. Judging legacy code by modern design paradigms ignores the brilliant optimization strategies required to make an entire living city fit into 32 megabytes of system memory on the PlayStation 2. Ultimately, playing Grand Theft Auto San Andreas correctly on modern PCs requires the community to step in where official compatibility layers failed, utilizing custom community modifications to decouple the game's core logic ticks from the visual render pipeline.
It proves that preserving interactive art isn't just about preserving the code itself, but about preserving the precise temporal conditions under which that code was designed to exist.